When one thinks of the Romans, a single man comes to mind. Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, slayer of Pompey, and destroyer of the Roman Republic. This man's story and feats have become synonymous with the Roman Empire, and you can't have one without the other. And whilst at first it is fairly obvious why this man's fame has grown so far as to represent his culture in the modern eye, when researching figures who obtained similar feats to Caesar, such as Augustus, Sulla, and Cincinnatus, it becomes more difficult to understand what made Caesar so much more of an iconic historical figure that he became the figurehead of the Romans, while Sulla and Cincinnatus became lost to the modern eye. After all, Sulla was arguably a more successful Caesar, and yet everyone remembers Veni Vidi Vici. But who remembers? No friend ever served me, and no enemy ever wronged me, whom I have not repaid in full. And so, I'm going to take a deeper dive into the character of Caesar to establish what sets him apart from other Roman figures of equal caliber, to the extent that he has become a symbol of the Roman Empire, and understand that this is not a criticism or downplaying of the man. His feats were incredible and had vast lasting effects on the Roman civilization. However, no other historical figure has become so intertwined and representative of their civilization. Some come close, such as George Washington for the USA and Churchill for Britain, but not to the extent of Caesar, whose even cognomen, meaning family name, Caesar, has come to represent the emperors of Rome. So take a seat and relax, as we explore why Julius Caesar became the face of Rome. A good starting point is the most obvious one, his feats, and these come in three core sections. Military success abroad, especially in Gaul, which is north of Rome, making up modern-day France and parts of Italy, Germany, and Belgium. His victory in the civil war against Pompey the Great, and his disruption of the Roman Republic, which laid the path for the emperors to follow. Now let's first focus on Caesar's military successes abroad, where two main achievements come to mind. As mentioned, the conquering of Gaul and the landing on the very exotic land of Britain. Now, Britain we can write off quite quickly, as not being a major segment of Caesar's legendary legacy, as his invasions of Britain in 55 and 54 BC were very brief due to his having to also deal with the war in Gaul simultaneously. And even though landing in Britain itself was a major propaganda victory for Caesar, he was quickly outdone in AD 43 by his own admirer Emperor Claudius, who successfully invaded Britain, leading to his control by the Romans for over 400 years. No, Caesar's greatest victory abroad was by far his conquering of Gaul, which he extensively recorded in his De Bello Gallico, which is modern historians' main source on the Gallic Wars between 58 and 50 BC. Now, Gaul had always been a problem for the Romans due to the Gallic and Germanic tribes' favourite pastime being rebelling against the Romans. However, after Caesar, Gaul became completely passive to Rome until Augustus' reign, where he had to deal with dangerous Germanic tribes who had crossed the Rhine. Clearly, this was one of Caesar's greatest feats, and whilst it would have made him extremely popular and heroic among the Romans, it is just not enough to explain why Caesar has become the most prominent Roman figure of all time. After all, there were many other significant Romans who had achieved great military victories, such as Pompey's victories over King Mithridates in 63 BC, Cincinnatus defeating the Aequi in 458 BC, Augustus' conquering of Cleopatra's and Mark Antony's Egypt, and Scipio Africanus' victory in the Second Punic War in 201 BC. Evidently, Rome has a history of great generals achieving astounding victories, and while Caesar's is one of the most significant, it still does not explain why Caesar has exceeded the other generals in significance for Rome, and why the modern public views Caesar as the greatest Roman general, not others such as Scipio Africanus and Cincinnatus. Thus, we have to look in another direction for an answer in Caesar's feats, and this may very well be his most famous victory, his defeat of Pompey and conquering of Rome. The civil war between 49 to 45 BC began when Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his 8 legions to fight and eventually defeat one of the greatest Roman generals in history, Pompey the Great, who had over 13 legions along with auxiliaries at his disposal. And so you might point to it and tell me, well, of course this is why Caesar is the face of Rome. He achieved one of the greatest victories in Roman history, which would change the future of the civilization forevermore. And I would have to agree with you, apart from the fact that, with a pattern that is starting to become quite common, this had been done before, and would be done again. Only around 30 years before Caesar famously crossed the Rubicon, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man of similar talents to Caesar, did not march on Rome once, but twice. The first time being in 88 BC after the Social War, as he wanted to replace Gaius Marius as a leader of a campaign against King Mithridates, the very same one Pompey defeats. And the second occurring between 83 to 82 BC, where Sulla famously overthrew Gaius Marius, who had taken over Rome in Sulla's absence. Sulla would go on to be appointed dictator for life in 82 BC, and, being an Optimate, constitutionally reform Rome to bring power back to the Senate. Sulla would then go on to retire in 79 BC, which he would remain in until his death in 78 BC. Now, looking back to Julius Caesar, we see a very similar pattern. Both men marched on Rome, disposing a key opponent, whether it be Gaius Marius or Pompey the Great. Both men appointing themselves dictator for life, and would bring reforms to Rome. What differed the two was that one kept the Senate on his side and was able to retire peacefully, whilst the other angered the Senate through edging closer to becoming a king rather than dictator, resulting in his assassination in 44 BC. Thus, cynically, one might say that Sulla was just a more successful Julius Caesar. However, it is still Caesar, not Sulla, who everyone associates with the Roman Empire. Thus, if Caesar's most famous feat doesn't provide an answer, perhaps its result will. Many credit Caesar for bringing the end of the Roman Republic due to his marching on Rome and then the writing of his will, which gave his possessions to the people and his adopted son Octavian. However, I see Caesar as more of a catalyst for the Republic's end than its main cause, as the Republic had many flaws and was just unable to control such a vast land which the Romans ruled. And with Roman generals becoming more powerful ever since Gaius Marius conscripted soldiers and promised their pensions from his own pocket, resulting in the absolute loyalty of the soldiers to their generals rather than state, the pathway was laid for a man to rise up and take Rome as his own. We see this with Sulla and Caesar, and if the Republic would have continued after Caesar, another general would have marched on Rome. The fall of the Republic was inevitable. And the man who really deserved the claim of bringing the end of the Republic was Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, who would defeat Mark Antony in the civil war similar to Caesar's with Pompey and establish the Principate, a system that would become the staple of the Roman Empire for the next 500 years as emperors ruled. Clearly, if the reason Caesar has become the face of Rome is because he started the Roman Empire, Augustus would have been more famous than Caesar, and not the other way around. Thus, looking through Caesar's feats, sure, they are impressive, but they are just not enough to explain why Caesar represents the Roman civilization, as other men accomplished what Caesar had, and a few, such as Augustus, did it better. So perhaps we need to look at Caesar in another angle, specifically his character and popularity with the people. If his character represented the key Roman values, perhaps this is why he has come to represent his people, being the perfect Roman. And if he was popular with the people, he would be elevated in their literature, culture, and archaeology, to the extent that it would be hard for a modern viewer not to associate Caesar with the entirety of the Roman Empire. Well, in terms of popularity, it is quite evident that Caesar was a very popular politician with the people. Even before marching on Rome, his conquering of Gaul and landing in Britain would have made him a hero among the people, and admired for his courage and bravery. And then once he became dictator for life, his popularity would only ever increase due to his being a populist politician and focusing on the needs of the people, disregarding the wants of the Senate, which would result in his death. Even after death, his popularity seemed to grow even further, as his will promised 75 drachmas per Roman citizen, which obviously very well received by the people, and would also receive an apotheosis, becoming a god after death, which would cement Caesar in Roman culture for eternity. So yes, Caesar was very popular, and would be glorified by the Romans to the extent that in the modern day, he is one of the most famous Romans in history. However, I still do not think this is enough of a reason as for why Caesar has risen above all other Romans, as once again, there were still many other Romans who were very popular with the people. To name a few, Cincinnatus, Augustus, and Trajan. An apotheosis wasn't as rare as one might think for Roman leaders, with emperors such as Augustus, Claudius, Vespasian, and Titus, with Vespasian even allegedly stating just before he died, "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." And so even if one might argue that Caesar was more popular than the Romans I've mentioned, I do not think that is to such an extent that he has risen so far above the other famous Romans to become the face of Rome. Being slightly more popular doesn't excuse Caesar's much greater fame. And so, then we look at Caesar's character, and he does distinctly represent the greatest Roman virtues which stemmed from two main philosophies in Rome: Epicureanism and Stoicism. Those being courage, wisdom, justice, and temperance. He clearly contained much courage. After all, he was one of the greatest military generals in history, and even had the guts to cross the Rubicon and face an equally powerful man, Pompey the Great, who led more men than Caesar. Caesar was also wise. He understood the power of the people and knew how to manipulate it, even after death with his will, and underlying this is a sense of justice, as finally there was a man who wasn't focused on pleasing the aristocrats and preferred to aid the common man in a crumbling republic. However, if there was one virtue Caesar lacked, it was temperance. He was highly ambitious, as seen with his military exertions in Gaul, Britain, and even Rome. But this eventually led to his downfall, as he wasn't able to control himself. As he continued to rise in power as dictator for life, he was unable to control himself and be more modest, which angered the Senate as they feared that he was becoming a king, and so assassinated him to save the Republic. Thus, Caesar was not the full package when it came to Roman virtue, whilst men such as Cincinnatus and Augustus were. Cincinnatus left his role as a farmer to lead Rome as dictator and save it from the Aequi, and once he succeeded, he went back to the humble life of a farmer. Cincinnatus was a true Roman, fighting for the state rather than himself. Augustus, on the other hand, was very similar to Caesar when it came to virtues, However, the key difference was that Augustus had temperance, being very modest and refusing many titles such as that of God, emphasizing that he was just the first among citizens, resulting in his reign for over 40 years as he was beloved by everyone. Thus, it is clear Caesar's character does not fully represent a true virtuous Roman, unlike a few other Romans in history. However, he is the one who has come to represent Rome. Thus, the answer must lie somewhere else. And I think that the answer is not his feats or character, but the result of the two. His dramatic story, which encapsulates the nature of the Romans. This civilization is very dramatic. From great civil wars caused by the clashing of great men's ambitions and grandiose rises and falls of leaders and governments, to eccentric figures leading the civilization and monumental military campaigns to destroy any threat. Drama is ever present in Rome, which is inevitable for such a long-lived culture. And this is perfectly encapsulated by Caesar, a man rising to power through political intrigues and military prowess, accomplishing military feats thought impossible, being so ambitious as to march on Rome and defeat the greatest Roman general at the time, Pompey, beheading him and carrying his head around Alexandria, also defeating the skilled politician Cato, who gruesomely kills himself by removing the stitching from a previous attempt and ripping out his guts. And after all this, Caesar is finally the top man of Rome. And suddenly tragedy strikes as not even a year later he is assassinated by the Senate, with the most famous death in history in the theatre of Pompey, his greatest enemy. But finally, Caesar has the last laugh as his will gives money to the people and names his heir as Octavian, which would result in the fall of the Republic and the establishment of the emperors. This is an incredible story, one which sounds more fiction than real, and yet this was the life of Caesar, his story as dramatic as his civilization. And no other famous Roman can claim to have such a life as Caesar. Since Senatus went back to farming, Pompey lost to Caesar, Augustus reigned and peacefully remained very modest, preferred to rule in the background, and Sulla retired and died of illness. Thus, it is Caesar, and no other Roman who represents the true nature of the Romans. Dramatic and eccentric events which, whilst one struggles to believe, are in fact real. It is not for no reason that such a prolific writer as Shakespeare was fascinated with the Romans, and would even write a play about Julius Caesar. At the end of the day, the Romans loved drama, and no other figure represents that to such an extent as Julius Caesar, which is why he finds himself to be the face of the Romans, a man who lived one of the most eccentric and compelling lives in history, represents one of the most eccentric and compelling civilization in history. Thank you for coming with me to explore the exciting life of Julius Caesar, and I hope you will return to continue to traverse the classical world with me in future videos, focusing not only on the Romans, but also the ancient Greeks and Persians. I will also be soon getting a new mic, and so I apologize if the audio quality is not as great on this video. It should get better in future videos. In the description, I shall have some key terms and an explanation as to what they are if some people are unsure what I mean when I use them in the video. Once again, thank you, and I hope to see you again in the future.